And our next speaker, Professor Michael Birnhack from Tel Aviv University. Michael is actually, used to be for a very short period of time the head of Privacy Israel, which tells you a lot about what interests him. He's a professor of law at Tel Aviv University. He used to be at the University of Haifa. Before that, he's mostly interested in topics which are surprisingly related to privacy and how technology and law intertwine together. And it's a great pleasure to have Michael. Michael, the floor is yours.
So, good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. And as I do this, I'm sharing my screen and hopefully it will even work. So, does that work or not yet? Okay, ta-da, magic happens. That should be okay. So thank you, Or and Ellie and Susie for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I was asked to speak about Privacy 101, the basics of privacy law. For the lawyers among you, this should not be new, but I do hope to offer some interesting framing of the questions and challenges at stake. The discussion is general and is not limited to Israeli law, so don't run away just because of that. So what I would like to discuss is first just, discuss a little bit about the nature of privacy, or in his opening comments has pointed to that issue. And then I would like to discuss the different social context and matching legal categories that try to address these social contexts, but don't always manage to do so. Then we will focus on data protection law, and if time permits, we will discuss also issues of privacy by design, and if time permits, even more specifically, contact tracing technologies. And if we still have some more time, we will discuss the global effect of the GDPR. Okay, let's begin. And one way that I found effective to discuss the essence of privacy is through covers of books on privacy that were published in the last 20 years or so. This is one theme that is quite common. A keyhole, locks, someone peeping. This indicates or conveys the message that privacy is about secrecy, that privacy is about locked places. And the physicality is important here, the peeping is important here, and secrecy is the message of these kinds of images. We have some more of these, the peeping eye, watching vision is a very dominant theme in covers of privacy books, but also it conveys something about what we think about privacy. It's someone watching, surveilling someone else. It can be the human eye, and increasingly it can be a technology that does what humans used to do, the CCTV in this case. Then we move into more mass surveillance. So from the guy who uses the binoculars to someone who watches multiple screens. This reminds us that there are human beings behind the cameras. They watch, they may watch, but we do not always know whether they are actually watching. And this is the essence of the panopticon here in the Hebrew version of Foucault's book that Or has mentioned before. The power of watching lies in the fact that we, the data subjects, do not know whether we are being watched, when, how, by whom, and for what purpose, etc. We move on to another set of covers of books on privacy, and once again we see locks. Now the focus is on information and how to lock the information, and also some architecture, the windows, the opening, what can be seen from the outside, inside, divisions of public and private that become blurred in some cases such as, the open window in our inside personal private home. New technologies join, whether these are biometrics or, of course, the cell phones, mistakenly called smartphones, as also mentioned, I think they should be called personal surveillance devices or something along those lines. Then we moved to mass surveillance, whether by the state, satellites, and NSA kind of stuff, or in more sophisticated ways by penetrating our own devices with Trojan horses, etc. So we've seen secrecy, we've seen privacy in places, we have seen people watching other people, we have seen technologies watching other people, and we now see the state or states watching other people in their own countries or elsewhere. Privacy, as we all know, everybody who's joined this summer school, is becoming more and more complex. And conceptual covers convey this message, whether it's the sort of big bang on Ari Ezra Waldman's book, or this network in Helen Nissenbaum's book, or some sort of design in Woody Hartzog's book on the right-hand side. Finally, these are covers of two books in Hebrew, but you get the idea. I've written the one on the left and edited the one on the right. So the one on the left conveys the image of we are all the same. We are all being controlled. Barcode, this was 10 years ago. Today I would have done a QR, of course. And on the right, what happens to us when we realize that we are part of the surveillance mechanism. So we have a few ideas on the table, and let's see what we can make of them. So our discussion begins here. If you haven't seen this yet, so this you should have, and if not, so now you see it. This is an extremely famous caricature published in the New Yorker in 1993. On the internet, nobody knows you are a dog. These were the early days of the internet, or the popular internet, and people thought that they have privacy because they used their PC, their personal computer. They logged on in the middle of the night and they used obscure nicknames and thought, oh, I'm so private on the internet. So on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog, 1993. Only 6 years later, Scott McNeely came up with this statement. You have zero privacy anyway, get over it. Next. Now, Mr. McNeely was a Silicon Valley guy. Okay, he was the CEO of Sun Microsystem. As far as I know, he has no degree or specialization in sociology. Nevertheless, he came up with this statement. You have zero privacy anyway. That's a statement about facts in the world. Get over it. That's a normative kind of assessment. So, of course, his business model, or more generally Silicon Valley's ideology is that privacy is just some nuisance that we have to get rid of. And once again, we have the great sociologist, Mr. Zuckerberg, who repeatedly said privacy is no longer a social norm. Now, this is a kind of statement that we expect sociologists. Mr. Zuckerberg, as far as I know, does not hold a degree in sociology, but once again, he does hold a very important personal interest in us having less and less privacy. So we had the dog in 93 thinking he or she or us has no privacy, and then others who claim that there is no privacy. Obviously, this is a major tension. Now, I love this photo. Mr. Zuckerberg walking along this conference and people using VR devices, obviously not seeing him. If they would have noticed him, they would obviously look, etc. He is the boss. He sees everybody, nobody sees him. And that is exactly what happens on Facebook. Facebook sees everybody, and we do not know what Facebook does with our data. This is what Frank Pasquale called the black box society. And I love this image, especially in contrast to this one. This is when all eyes were turned at Mr. Zuckerberg when he was called to testify in Congress and explain a few things about Cambridge Analytica. Even then, when he was asked tough questions, he gave the following statement. I think the feedback that we've gotten from our community and from the world is that privacy and having the data locked down is more important to people than maybe making it easier to bring more data and have different kinds of experiences. In other words, even when he was grilled in Congress, Mr. Zuckerberg still does not acknowledge privacy on his own. It's people who say and they believe, and obviously he kind of, puts in the statement that it's privacy or more data and different kinds of experience, the either or, the inevitability of giving up privacy, which of course what makes his business. Now there's a very popular statement that people do not care about their privacy, that privacy is dead, that privacy is overrated, that privacy was nice for the 19th century, and maybe some parts of the 20th century, but we are done with that. This, of course, is nonsense, and we have data that shows that once people are given effective control over their personal data, they use it. So this is already pretty old, but it gives you the idea. At the beginning, Facebook required its users to disclose their exact birthday and their high school. But when given the opportunity not to disclose that data, many people have hopped on and were happy not to disclose that data. There are repeated studies of this kind, and people are interested in privacy. They don't always know how to manage it, and it's becoming more and more complicated. Sometimes they may give up their privacy in exchange for services, benefits, etc. But when given the control in a way that they can actually exercise it, people do prefer their privacy. On the left is the cover of Dana Boyd's book. It's complicated. Dana interviewed, she's an American-Canadian data scientist, media studies scholar. She has interviewed hundreds of American teenagers and kids and came up with the same conclusion about kids, even though we, the old guys, think that, oh, look at what all those kids post online, they have given up privacy. No, they have not. And in fact, once again, this already is a bit old, but nevertheless, it gives us the idea. Once again, we see that the younger you are, the more control you take over your own privacy, and the older you are, the less control you have over one's privacy. This is regarding whether your Facebook profile is private or public. Okay. Let's go backwards and see what we have and how the law deals with all of this. The digital trail. From the very first moment we wake up in the morning, we create data, whatever we do. One of the first things we do when we wake up is reach out to the not smartphone, the personally tracking device, and we check messages. We checked who liked our posts and photos on Instagram or with Facebook or Twitter or whatever it is, who sent us emails, what is the weather and what's the news, etc., etc. We, of course, convey lots of information to the service providers. We convey information that we woke up. We convey information about our interests, about our social networks, about our friends, and much more. As we eventually get out of bed, we begin operating all kinds of electricity utilities, we use water, etc. We will have, if we don't have already, we will have a smart grid which will indicate to the utility providers what, when, exactly, which devices did we operate, how much, etc. Eventually, at some point, we get out of the home, out of the house, and we go to the office, to the university, or elsewhere, and our location is traced, etc., etc. Whatever we do online, and our lives are online today, this all creates data. Once this data is created, there are other parties who are very much interested in collecting the data and using it for their own purposes, not for our purposes, but it's always for their own purposes. Remember Mr. McNeely and Mr. Zuckerberg in this context. And here comes the privacy challenges. So when people talk about privacy, some of them think about Facebook and Google and these kinds of companies. Others think about the state, big brother kind of images, and others think about privacy in the more social interaction between us, between human beings. So let's divide the privacy challenges into these three categories. Each of them, very broadly speaking, is a social context, and we will see the law that matches or tries to answer these social situations. So let's begin with the state. The state needs data, and the state needs data for law enforcement purposes, for cybersecurity and other security issues, fighting terrorism, etc. And just managing the state. The state is a big operation, and it needs information so that the government knows what the needs are and how to allocate resources and manage all kinds of systems, social welfare, education, health, etc., including managing pandemics. So the government uses increasingly more and more technologies to do all of this. These can be CCTV cameras, various computer systems, biometrics, including for ID. Aadhaar is the Indian biometric project. We increasingly hear government, central and local, speak about smart cities where everything is connected to everything else. We need data for pandemics. There are body scanners in airports, etc., etc. We all know that. Now, all of this, taken into legal language, are legitimate aims, legitimate purposes. We would like our state, whether it's Israel, the United States, India, or any other country, we would like our government to be able to have law enforcement, cybersecurity, to fight terror, etc., etc. So we are interested in all of that, but obviously that requires collecting and processing a lot of personal data. And that obviously raises issues of privacy. To answer that, we treat privacy as a constitutional fundamental human right. And we see that, for example, in the EU Charter, Article 7 is about privacy and Article 8 is about data protection. In Germany and in Israel, privacy is anchored in basic laws. In the US, it's not in the Constitution, but the Supreme Court of the US has acknowledged privacy, as did the Indian Supreme Court and many other countries which have opted either for a constitutional right or a constitutional right as the courts have interpreted. This limits what the state can do. Typically, we see that the state can violate and infringe citizens' privacy rights, but this should be done in a law for a legitimate aim, purpose, and in a proportional way. And of course, details are very important here. We also have administrative law. This is the body of law which looks at what agencies and regulators, etc., do and how they make decisions. And they are required, and administrative law details how exactly that should be done. All these regulators and administrations and agencies, etc., they should take privacy into consideration. So all of this is one sphere, the state versus the citizen. Then we move on to the corporation and the citizen. This is where Apple, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, etc. come into the picture. It can be online companies, such as the above. It can be specific service providers, such as Waze, or very local, physical, offline services, such as city bikes or supermarkets. The loyalty cards, they are there not because we want to be part of the VIP club of the supermarket. No offense to anybody who may be in the supermarket business, but it's not that prestigious to be a member of your local Tesco or whatever it is. The loyalty card is there because it's the way in which the supermarket collects data about us and about our habits. So the next time you go shopping, look at your cart and you wear a detective hat. From just looking at one single cart, we can figure out more or less whether we buy stuff for us, for one person, for two people, for three, whether we have kids. It's quite obvious whether we, for example, have some dietary issues, whether, for example, we buy stuff which fits people with celiac. It's quite obvious what is our religious inclination, whether we buy only halal or kosher food, etc., etc. Take that data over years and years, and the supermarket knows exactly what happens to us. The supermarket knows that we are single, and now that we are a couple, and now that we have a baby, and now that we have another baby. The supermarket knows that we are now we buy more expensive stuff, or now we buy only organic food, etc., etc. Corporations collect data, and they collect data because they can, and they collect data because that's their business. Okay, Amazon, in its book selling capacity, is not just an online bookshop. It's a data-based business who happens to sell books, and in that way collects lots of data and uses that data in order to sell us more stuff, whether we need it or not. How do we answer the privacy issues here? This is the body of law known as data protection law, informational privacy. This is where the GDPR comes into play, etc. And I will come back to that later on. For the time being, we have seen two social contexts. One is the citizen and the state. Another is the consumers. It's the same people, it's us. But now we wear the hat of consumers, and we interact with corporations, with companies. But here's a problem, and Mr. Snowden has pointed us to this problem. It's often the case that the government and the corporations, the service providers, they hold hands together. This is the handshake, and it's invisible. So it's the invisible hand of the market, and it's the handshake between the government and the private realm, the corporations, and they work together. And anybody who has read the USA Patriot Act in 2001 following September 11 has realized that the USA Patriot Act has laid the legal foundations that facilitated this handshake, and Mr. Snowden has revealed to us the extent and scope and depth of that handshake. Now, what's the problem here? The problem is that by joining hands together, the government bypasses all the constitutional checks and balances that it was subject to. If the government were to collect the data directly from us, it would have been subject to constitutional law, and it should have explained what exactly is the purpose. Is it legitimate? Is it proportional? Etc. But that would be very difficult, and at least in the United States and in probably the EU and many other countries, that would probably be impossible. So what did the government do? It turned to the corporations and said, hey, well, you already have all that data because you work under a different legal category, which is way more permissive, data protection law. Can you share that data with us? It's really important. It's to fight terrorism. And corporations happily do so. They do so because, well, they want to be patriotic themselves. It's the USA Patriot Act. And another reason is that they want to have good relationships with the government, because today they help the government, tomorrow the government will help them. So the invisible handshake is where the government and the corporations bypass legal requirements in the constitutional sphere for the benefit of these two players at the cost of our privacy, even though the purpose, fighting terrorism, is of course an important one. And now we have a third sphere. This is privacy 2.0. This is when we collect data about ourselves and about our friends. So I typically ask my students, so here I am asking you too, do you ask permission from people you take photographs of before you take their photographs? Many people say, of course. Is it always the case? I'm pretty sure that many of us have taken photos of other people without asking permission. Do we ask permission before posting photos online and tagging people? Many people do, but not everybody, not all the time. One of the issues here is social norms. We think that it's impolite to do so without asking for permission. And we know that some people are very sensitive about these kinds of things. But not everybody shares these social norms. This is a new technological environment, and things keep changing. And in a changing dynamic environment, social norms are not so clear. They're in the making. And when it's still in the making, then some people will do things that others will disapprove of. Google Glass. So Mr. Brin, Sergey Brin, wears here the Google glasses. You know, it has failed. It has failed because people didn't like being spied by other people. We are okay with a company collecting data, sort of. We are okay with the government collecting data about us, sort of. But we didn't like it when people, other people, collect data about us. Truecaller is another example. It's a great app. I use it myself. If you're unfamiliar with that, it indicates who's calling you, even if they're not your contacts. So this is a great way to see that my boss is calling me and not to answer. This is a great way to see that this is, you know, some spam basically trying to sell something, etc., etc. But how does Truecaller work? Well, once we install the app, when we do that thing which says, okay, okay, next, I agree, nobody reads the privacy policies, right? When we do so, we enable Truecaller access to our contact list, to our contacts list. That's how, by gathering contact lists from all its many users, Truecaller is able to provide the server and say, oh, that's your boss calling. What do we do here? Social norms can be effective, but they don't quite work, not everywhere, not all the time. Law. This is where tort law comes into operation. This is good old classic privacy torts, peeping Tom, eavesdropping, wiretapping, publishing private information of other people, etc. However, this category, this social context of us, people interacting with each other, is also subject to or interacts with the other categories that we have mentioned. And this guy, Chris Wiley, has revealed the Cambridge Analytica scandal. What happened there? Kind of, you know, there are lots of question marks to this day, but we do know that users on Facebook, each of them individually had a contract, a license, including a privacy policy, which nobody reads, with Facebook. So this is under data protection law, okay? And each of us, or each of the Facebook users, has consented to some things in terms of giving information to Facebook, etc. But then when Facebook interacted with a scholar at Cambridge, Professor Alex Kogan, and he was working with a corporation, Cambridge Analytica. All sorts of things, many of them under question mark, have happened there, and the result was that information that users provide about each other, something which is in the social sphere, becomes part of the corporate sphere, and if used to influence politics and elections, etc., as probably has happened, well, that interacts in the state sphere. So everything here collapses. So we have seen, just as an interim summary, we have seen that we sometimes are citizens and we interact with the state, and the law responds with constitutional and administrative law. Sometimes we are consumers and then we interact with corporations, and this is where data protection law comes into play. And sometimes we are just human beings and interact with other human beings. And this is where tort law and social norms come into play. However, the arrows on the right indicate that these are not independent categories. They all mix together in mysterious ways, invisible in some cases. Okay, let's now turn to data protection law. So just recall, this is the body of law that handles, or tries to handle our relationship with corporations that collect data. We have seen over the years the emergence of FIPs. FIPs are Fair Information Practices, sometimes spelled with double P, and then it means Fair Information Practice Principles or Fair Information Privacy Principles, as you choose. It started locally in Germany 50 years ago in the state of Hesse. It continued in the United States in a post-Watergate discussion in the States in the US Privacy Act. Now, this act deals with information handled by government agencies only. So it's not the corporate sphere. But there were important principles that were developed there, FIPs. This was then adopted as guidelines. So it's not binding law, it's only guidelines, soft law by the OECD in 1980 in very powerful guidelines. We then see the Council of Europe adopting Convention 108, and also Israel joining with its 1981, quite early in the day, Privacy Protection Act. We then see some other local laws, and then the major game changer, the EU's Data Protection Directive from '95. It was a game changer because it was binding, although only on the member states of the EU, up until recently 28, and now 27 member states of the EU. Now that becomes already more important. These are more countries, it's no longer local, it's no longer just recommendations. This is binding law for those countries. We then see the constitutionalization of privacy as a fundamental human right in the European Charter of Fundamental Rights in 2000. And then, of course, last year, this is already FIPS 2.0, the GDPR, alongside important decisions by the European Court of Justice. Today, we have data protection laws in over 140 countries. The most recent one to join just a few weeks ago is Egypt, Israel's neighbor from the south. So I haven't said anything about the content of FIPS yet, I will say shortly, but just to give you a picture, snapshot of the emergence of the law, from local, soft law to global and increasingly binding laws. Data protection law tries to deal with lots of challenges. Profiling, like the supermarket and Google and Facebook and Amazon and all those companies do. The loss of control, it's impossible for us to negotiate our privacy with Google, Facebook, etc. Lots and lots of data are collected without our consent because, let's face it, nobody reads those extremely long so-called privacy policies, which in fact are giving up our privacy policies. We don't exactly know what's going on with our data once it is collected. As we've heard in the previous talk, anonymization is in many cases a nice fairy tale that we can tell our children, but it's not really reliable, and the re-identification is becoming easier and easier. And of course, there's a great demand, there's a huge demand for our data. It can be for the businesses, it can be for the state, but it can also be for important things such as medical research, fighting pandemics, etc. Okay, so FIPs. What's in FIPs? When we look at all those legal instruments that I've mentioned earlier, 2 slides ago, we see that they share more or less the same set of principles. Now, there are lots of nuances in different jurisdictions, but the basic structure is the same. Notice, inform the users, the data subjects, prior to collecting data in a way that they can understand and exercise choice. Tell them what's going on. These are the privacy policies which, as I mentioned earlier, nobody really reads. Once we more or less know that who wants to collect data for which purpose, we can exercise consent, or so at least FIPs tell us. How exactly to do that? That once again becomes difficult. It should be free, which means that when my employer demands, requires that I give information, well, I can't really say no to my boss. So it's not exactly free. Opt-in, opt-out. Most people do not see that they have an option. They do not know how to change things, the default rules. They're afraid that if they change, things will not work. So they don't. Default rules are sticky, as my colleagues from law and economics call it. So consent is a nice idea, but it doesn't really work. The next step is say, okay, the data was collected, let's limit, so say FIPs, so says the law. Let's limit, which data can be collected. In some cases, we might say, well, this cannot be collected. We do see such examples, it's pretty rare. We see that typically in the employment context and sometimes in other cases. The data should be collected for a legitimate purpose. What is a legitimate purpose? Well, that is up for debate. Only the minimum amount of data should be collected, etc. So these are legal principles that apply to the early stages in the life cycle of the data. Once the data was legitimately collected, the law says, okay, here you collected the data, it's okay, we allow that, but now when the corporation, the data controller, wants to use that data, there's some limitations. For example, it can be used only for the original purpose for which the data subject has consented to. Okay, this is the purpose limitation principle. The data should be secured. Now, computer science, when asked about privacy, they talk about security. Security is important, but it's only one element. It's only one sub-principle of privacy. It's not, do not equate privacy with data security, okay? Confidentiality is another important principle. Access and amendment rights, these are rights that are given to us, the data subjects, and hopefully there is some enforcement. The enforcement can be by a specialized regulator, this is the DPA, the Data Protection Agency, or it can be privatized. For example, class actions in countries that have this legal mechanism, or in some other ways in which the law incentivizes data subjects to sue, even though the damage, the individual damage, is quite unknown, but quite small for each of us. For example, statutory damages in countries which have that. Okay, so we have a set of principles, and as I sort of gave a very rough overview of them, I also pointed to their limits and shortcomings of each of them. Enter the GDPR. The GDPR entered into force 2.5 years ago, and it takes us to the second generation of FIPs. It insists on transparency and accountability as underlying principles. And accordingly, it adds new duties imposed on the data controllers, and it gives us, the data subjects, new rights. So, for example, data breach notification duty. We are a company, we have lots of data. Oh my God, we had a breach. And we had a breach because some bad hacker hacked into our system, or more common, one of our employees used a very sophisticated password to protect the data, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, for example. If this happens, we are under a duty to notify either the regulator or the public at large that, hey, we had a problem. And we do see such notifications every now and then, quite often, to say to be frank. Data protection by design. So on Wednesday, I believe, there will be a talk by Anne Kavokian, and if time permits, I will say a bit about that. Importantly, the law turns to technology, okay, under this idea. We see new rights, most famously the right to be forgotten, data portability, which is more of an antitrust competition issue, but it's a way in which we, data subjects, can control our data, hence it's in the GDPR. What we see in the GDPR, generally speaking, other than the direct application within the EU, if you're European, you know what I'm talking about. If not, you don't really have to care about that. What we see other than more rights and more duties is an increasing handing over of responsibility to technology and to organizational measures. Now, by way of disclosure, I love the GDPR, but the GDPR is not everything. As Larry Lessig has told us, when we have a problem, when we have some human activity that we would like to regulate, we can turn to the law, and that's what we have discussed now. We can turn to social norms, but as I've mentioned earlier, in new technological contexts, etc., the social norms are not clear enough. We can turn also to technology and organizational means. So for the law, we have FIPs. We have, for the social norms, education. That's extremely important. And education is not only school and high school. It's also of citizens, consumers, and engineers, okay? I've conducted several studies in which we interviewed or surveyed engineers, and we asked them questions about privacy, and we got answers about data security, okay? Indicating a too narrow perspective and perception of privacy, whereas in fact privacy is much more than data security. Social norms can be in the form of public protest. So following Cambridge Analytica, there was the Delete Facebook movement. I do not know how successful it was. When we turn to technology, pets, privacy enhancing technology, privacy by design. Let's talk a bit about organizational means. PIA, Privacy Impact Assessment. The idea is very simple. The idea, by the way, is borrowed from environmental law. And the idea is that, well, before you begin planning, and definitely before you begin using some new technological system, study the issue and study the privacy aspects of what's going on. Once again, privacy is not only data security. We should do some homework before we, engage in some new technology, whether it's Waze or whatever it is. We should think about the data. Which data will be collected? Do we need all this data? Why do we need all this data? Where will we store the data? Who will have access to the data? What will we be using the data for? That's crucial. Will we be handing it to someone else? Why? To whom? Where are they? Are they in our jurisdiction, in another jurisdictions, in another jurisdiction, etc. Once we know more, we can plan. How do we plan? Well, we need someone to plan. This is where the CPO, the Chief Privacy Officer, or the DPO, the Data Protection Officer, comes into play. If you haven't read, I strongly recommend this book, Privacy on the Ground, by Deidre Mulligan and Ken Bamberger, both of Berkeley, which document the emergence of this new profession, estimated by tens of thousands of people in the US and probably more in the EU, thanks to the GDPR. The DPO or CPO, it's not exactly the same, but for the time being, let's discuss them together. They should be senior officers in the organization. They should be someone accountable only to the CEO, and they should be someone that the CEO listens to. They should ask questions about which personal data does our organization collect? Why? How do we keep it? What are we using it for? Do we hand it over? They should begin snooping around the organization and ask questions about data. If they manage in their job, well, this will enable, hopefully, to change the privacy climate of the organization towards a more privacy-aware issue, etc. In the government, we do see more and more specific, project-specific CPOs. In Israel, for example, unfortunately, we have a biometric database, but at least it has a specified, unique person who is in charge of privacy aspects. Privacy by design, because I see we have 15 minutes, I will be very quick about this because you will have a talk by Miss Privacy by Design herself and Dr. Anne Kevokian. So Anne Kevokian, the former Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario, Canada, crystallized the idea of privacy by design into these principles. But the idea, basically, the most important one, I think, is number 3. Embed privacy into the design. This idea is addressed to engineers, not to lawyers. And it says, hey, engineer, you were asked to plan a system that will do A, B, C. Wonderful. Now you are beginning the design of how to design, how to build a program, technology, a system, whatever it is, that will achieve A, B, and C. This is what you were asked to do. You also think about usability, right? You also think about how to make the technology scalable, all sorts of words that engineers love. Please, Privacy by Design asks, please think also about privacy. That's it. Now, this means that engineers should have an understanding of what privacy by design is, of what privacy is. And that's not easy. Privacy by design has gained global attention in 2010 when adopted as the Jerusalem Resolution at the conclusion of the 32nd International Conference of Data Protection Commissioners. It was mentioned towards companies as a recommendation by the FTC in the US, which has become de facto the privacy regulator over there. And in the GDPR, it's a legal obligation. It requires, it's a duty to do data protection, as the Europeans call it, data protection by design. What exactly does that mean? That's a challenge. So I will skip some examples and hop over to privacy by design challenges. Well, when you say privacy, the smart, sophisticated engineer will ask, what exactly do you mean? Do you mean privacy as explained by Alan Weston? Or maybe by Ruth Gavison, who passed away sadly a few weeks ago? Or maybe you mean privacy according to Helen Nissenbaum. What kind of privacy do you have in mind? The engineer will also know that their boss, the business, they want more information. The businesses are interested in collecting more and more information, The more data they have, the better. What exactly will they do with all the data? Doesn't matter. We will find something to do with it. We will do big data analysis. We will find what to do with the data. So the engineer knows, and they will get the vibe sooner or later, that the business doesn't like privacy by design. Okay, let's say they have an idea of what privacy is. Let's say that they manage to convince the business department that it's important. What exactly do they do? How to translate legal principles into technology. This is where engineers can be extremely creative. This is where computer scientists, engineers, etc., can help the developers in doing what they are doing. Think about more creative ways to do that. And we will see an example shortly and then turn to some questions. Culturally, what exactly do the engineers think about privacy? Some of them might think that privacy is not important. And when asked to do privacy, well, they will have some dissonance there. One example, and with this I will conclude. So we are all facing the pandemic, unfortunately. We all know, as this New York Times graph shows, that it's extremely important to identify contacts, so to curtail the spread of the disease as soon as possible. To do so, we need the person to realize that he or she is sick, to test, and once they test positive, we are interested in identifying their contacts. How to do so? One way, which is not the good way to do so, is what the Israeli government has done, and that is use the Secret Service. Yes, the Israeli government is using its secret services, which is meant to be used to fight terrorism. The Israeli government uses it for its own citizens. This is not the way to do it. This is the way that harms privacy in the deepest sense possible. It's compulsory, it's secret, it's not transparent, and unfortunately, it doesn't seem to work well enough, unfortunately. Another way, which amazingly the Israeli government has done at the same time, sending a different message, the opposite message, is using applications. Now, by now, there are more than 40 different apps, contact tracing technologies in the world. Some of them, like HaMagen, Shield 1, disclosure, I advised the Israeli Ministry of Health on privacy aspects of HaMagen 1.0. This was a location-based application. It was decentralized and it's open source. So if you're a computer scientist, you can actually read the code of this. Another kind of application, the Singaporean one was one of the first one using this, was based not on data location, but on proximity location using Bluetooth. This can be centralized or decentralized, and the data can flow from here to there or the other way around. It can flow now or later. I'm adding parameters here using the kind of data collected, location or proximity, or maybe both, using the design of the system, centralized or distributed, using the direction of the flow of the data, adding the temporal dimension of what's going on when the data moves from which side, from which entity to another. All of this can help us shape an application, hopefully that achieves its goal to trace contacts, but that can preserve privacy in a reasonable way. Okay, so we have a lot on the table. Just to recap, we have privacy in the state sphere, we have privacy in the corporate sphere, and in the social sphere. We have different legal categories trying to address each. Each of the legal categories has its own challenges and problems, but they interact in ways that cause the collapse of the legal categories. We see constant development of these legal categories FIPs 1.0 to FIPs 2.0, adding more rights to us data subjects, imposing more duties on the data controllers, and increasingly turning to technologies and to organizational means. And we are only at the beginning of all of this. So thank you for listening. I hope you're still here. And questions for the next 7 or 10 minutes or so. Thank you.
Yes, this is one of the problems when you do it online. We have to simulate a large crowd because there is a large crowd. So first of all, thank you very much for the talk. It was very interesting, especially the fact that you're broadcasting from your house and you can see all the background images, which we can collect data and then check out exactly which artists you like.
Go for it. Not a chance you will identify this artist, but go for it.
I suspect I can, but this is something else. So one question to ask, and before that I just want to mention that we're going to have a panel. The last panel is going to be about sort of like the data commissioner's point of view. And of course, we're going to have also a panel about contact tracing. Actually, we have tomorrow a full day of contact tracing. How would you identify or recognize or categorize the previous examples of failures by Vanessa's talk, like the database of all transport? How does it contradict, or where does it fall with respect to the legal framework? So from your perspective, you see this database being released, probably for good reasons. Nobody really knows. Let's assume it was good intent of trying to optimize public transportation. And does it fit the legal framework?
Well, so we often see very good intentions leading to unintended consequences, right? So whoever released that data probably had good ideas about how we can improve public transportation in your example. And we have other examples such as Netflix, a very famous example, Netflix releasing data probably 10 years ago or so about users' habits, thinking that this anonymized, thinking that this will be a great resource for researchers. However, matching that with, I think it was with the IMDb database, was, easily I see that you are very fond of this genre of movies, especially at this time of the day or night or whatever. These are examples of either they have not done their homework, meaning they have not done a privacy impact assessment, or they have focused on data security, but not on other risks. And, judging by the results of these examples, they didn't do a good enough job in terms of privacy impact assessment or privacy by design or anonymization. Now, if we take a very strict position, it's either or, it's binary. And then the kind of zealous privacy guys would say, you cannot do that. Now, there are very few people, even among privacy people, privacy scholars, there are very few people who would opt for do nothing. Instead of yes or no, we should opt for risk analysis. And the GDPR has, in its spirit, much of that risk analysis rather than yes/no sort of decision. And the risks keep changing. Maybe 10 years ago, it was very difficult to re-identify people according to some databases, but now it would take 2 seconds. So whoever is in charge of the systems, the data controllers, they have to keep seeing what's going on and update constantly the measures that they undertake. It's challenging, but with creative engineering and sophisticated computer scientists, I believe it can be done. But you need the will. And if there's will, there's way.
So this brings another question from the audience. Ron is asking, regarding the tracking of COVID-19, what about the inherent collision between the value of life preservation with respect to privacy? I will just mention to some extent that there are two questions here, and most people are unaware of. The first one is the fact that the data is being collected, and the second one is being used, because there are two different aspects going on here. So if you can please...
Sure. So Ron asks a very intuitive question, which we see also in the Israeli Supreme Court, which has dealt with the legality of the Shin Bet surveillance. It's very intuitive to say, okay, life, privacy, no-brainer. Now, when you place the two, one against the other, it's a no-brainer. Of course, we prefer life to privacy. Without life, there will be no privacy, so that's obvious. However, I would like to challenge the this very framing of the issue. It's not either life or privacy. If both are important to us and we invest the effort, we can have both, and we don't have to decide how to do that. For example, privacy by design. Okay. If the application, the contact tracing application is good enough, then it will be able to trace contacts and maintain both the sick people and the people positive and the contacts' privacy. And, it's a challenge how exactly to do so, but it's possible. You just need to want to do so. Difficult to try and have both, but I do believe that we can have both. Privacy is important in managing pandemics. If I trust the government and I truly believe that the government is here to help us, okay, sometimes this is even true. If I genuinely believe the government, I trust, and when I trust, I will share more information. Because when I'm asked, if a sick person is asked where she has been in the past 2 weeks, if she trusts, she will trust the person who asks her and the government, she will say the truth. If she doesn't, she will hide. She will not disclose all information. And that will make things more difficult. In other words, privacy is crucial for managing pandemics. It's not an obstacle, it's a tool.
So one very quick last question, because we're running out of time, from Yossi, from privacy law aspect, does the anonymization process is considered legal?
Well, that's a tricky one. It depends. Okay, that's the typical legal answer. It depends whether that is done, whether there's a contract or license that limits some sort of reverse engineering. If there is, so it might be against the contract and illegal in this way. If de-anonymization requires breaking into the system, so you run into hacking laws and anti-hacking laws, etc., and I would not recommend doing so. If there's no contract and doing so does not require breaking into systems, so for the person who does the re-identification or tries to do the re-identification, it's more legitimate, but I would definitely suggest some legal advice, which I will not be giving, but someone should probably, it would be a good idea to ask a lawyer to look into the specifics of that before you go public with the data. You can brag that you managed to do so, but before you actually publish the data, I would ask for a specific legal opinion.
We're out of time, so I would like to thank you very much.
Thank you.
And before we take a 40 minutes break, I would like to remind everyone that in 40 minutes we're going to have Professor Ross Anderson, who is one of our keynote speakers. And I think now it's a good time to grab some lunch. So if you will turn around or to your right or to the left, depending on where you put the plates, each one has your own meal. So have a bon appetit and see you in 40 minutes.